Hello everyone, and welcome, and thank you for joining us. I'm Charles Quick, and I'm a co-curator of In Certain Places, an artistic research project at the University of Central Lancashire. Throughout the autumn, we're inviting people to rethink the way that their neighbours' hoods are planned through a series of creative infrastructure labs led by the artists Julia Heslop, Emily Speed, and Gavin Renshaw. This is a programme of online and on-the-ground activities aimed at local people and decision makers in Preston's City Deal areas, as well as anyone with an interest in building more livable places. We're broadcasting live on YouTube today, so if you'd like to contribute to the conversation or have any questions, please use the comment section of YouTube. We will try and address them towards the end of the discussion. We'd like to thank everybody who's been involved in organising the event, the artists, the guest speakers, and the team at In Certain Places for making it possible. So finally, I'd like to invite artist Julia Heslop to join us. Julia is going to talk about what can community spaces be and how might we create and maintain them, and introduce her guests. Welcome, Julia.
Thanks very much, Charles, and thanks very much for the invitation to be part of this and for inviting me to host one of the Creative Infrastructure Labs. So this is the first in a three-stage process, which is all about imagining and planning community spaces in the new Northwest Preston development. So this evening is about learning, and it's about being inspired from different contexts that enable us to think about how community space might emerge or be enabled within this new neighbourhood or area. So for those of you that might not know the area, I'm guessing most people probably don't know the area. The development is in the northwest of Preston. I'll show you a quick picture of it now. Here we are, hopefully you can see that. And it involves the building of around 5,000 new homes, as well as new roads, schools, shops, health centres. And as we can see from this image, there are two green spaces. So one is on the sort of left-hand side of the development, and the other is in the north side of the development. So the one on the left-hand side is an area which is an area of green space, which has pylons going through it. And the other green space is right next to the M55 there. So these are two sort of obvious social or community spaces. Just stop my screen share there. But it's not just the obvious spaces that are built specifically for community use that are important here. What we're really interested in exploring is informal spaces that grow over time. Most people are familiar with places created especially for the purpose of socialising or leisure, such as skate parks, playgrounds, community centres, community gardens, social clubs, places like that. But what about street corners for meeting, walls for sitting on, walking routes, flights of steps used for skating down? So often these are the things that can't just be built. They grow over time as neighbourhoods mature, as communities grow, as relationships are formed and people get to know each other and start to actually reappropriate their environment for themselves. So it's very much a process of living in a community and developing that from the ground up, I guess. So a key question is how to make space for the unplanned, for the sporadic, for the surprising, as well as for the planned, the consistent and the familiar as well, because these things are all important too. So today we'll be hearing from two very different contexts. So we'll be hearing from James Perry first. So he's one half of the architecture firm Harper Perry, and they're based in the northeast of England. And Silke Kapp, and she's a professor of architecture based in Belo Horizonte in Brazil. So part of what I wanted to do with this evening is to learn across radically different contexts. I mean, you know, Gateshead, Newcastle to Brazil. I mean, these are pretty different contexts. I think you'd agree with me. So, I suppose it's learning across different contexts in spite of their differences, which is really important here. So in my own work, I've studied self-build and informal housing processes in Albania and looked at what can be learnt for the UK housing context. So the place I was working in was also a sort of brand new community built from the ground up from residents and from people moving to the area and from the mountainous northern area of the country. And they built on land that was once an ex-collective dairy farm. So if you think about the context of Preston, that was, or still is in some parts, but farming land basically. So similar sort of context in that respect. But the community there in Albania built their own social, educational, commercial and medical infrastructure by themselves pretty much. And I found that learning between unlikely places and examples helps open up the imagination. It allows you to consider radically different ideas. For example, what ideas from Belo Horizonte could work in Preston? What can we learn about participation or self-organization or the politics of space from Brazil? So this question of participation, of self-organization is key here. So within this process, where is the community voice? So we hope that through these labs that we begin a fruitful conversation into how we might make space for the planned and unplanned community activity and create meaningful spaces that bring people together. However, what does participation or even community spaces look like in a time of pandemic? It's a difficult question. Furthermore, even if community spaces are built, how are they sustained, maintained, as well as grow in a time of falling public budgets? Who will pay for them? Who will maintain them? And what does it take to bring these ideas to fruition? And also, can collaboration happen meaningfully between communities, local authorities, and developers who are obviously developing this land out? So without doubt, we need to look at how COVID is impacting and will continue to impact our community and social spaces. But at the same time, it's taught us that communication at a neighborhood level is more important than ever. So we certainly can't let it untie our threads of social cohesion in terms of the long term anyway. But how can we make community spaces safe is obviously a key issue here. So these are some of the questions that I hope we can discuss further, both through the presentations, but also through the discussion at the end. So I want to bring in James Perry now. So James is a qualified town planner and architect, and he founded his firm Harper Perry in 2016. He's got extensive experience leading on large estate projects in London and has also worked for local authorities too. Since setting up Harper Perry, he continues to work between small and strategic scales, most recently completing the first housing design guide for Hull City. So I can bring James in now. Thank you.
Hi there, Julia. Thank you. Okay. Hopefully you can now see the presentation. Okay, I think I'll start. So thank you very much, Julia, for inviting me along to speak this evening. My name is James Perry. I'm an architect and planner, and I come from a background of working strategically with an urban design approach to my work. We've been running practices for 4 years now, and we're constantly finding ourselves jumping between sort of macro neighbourhood scales to thinking about sort of small scale interventions, which has sort of defined our work as a practice. So we're constantly moving back and forth. I think it's fair to say we have a sort of a planly sort of approach rather than a conventional sort of architect approach. Some of our previous work or some of our current work that we've been doing, like Drew says, so we have a background thinking at sort of strategic level, work with Hull City, sort of trying to plan at an urban scale right down to a sort of a macro sort of detail scale with the city to sort of improve their housing renovations and developments in the city. But we also build buildings in a sort of conventional sort of architect way. Sort of some work here sort of for Centre for Life, which is a museum here in sort of children's sort of museum here in Newcastle. So what does it mean to work with communities? I think in our experience, we found that there's actually quite a wide spectrum. And what means when we're working with communities as professionals is I think we have sort of quite a broad church of thinking, which we would say sort of probably ranges from informing to co-designing. On the level of informing, I think we would sort of say that's more of a top-down sort of technical expert approach, the sort of what I might think of as more conventional architect planner role. And I think that manifests itself in these sort of slightly painful consultation exercises I'm sure some of you would have attended or even been part of. I've been on both sides as an architect, and I don't find them particularly helpful. And at the opposite end, I think you've got this sort of co-designing. It's not really bottom up. I would say it's more sort of intrinsic embedded role. So if anyone's familiar with the man in the centre, that's Ralph Erskine, and he's working in the biker community in the redevelopment in the sort of late 70s, early 80s in Newcastle, where he sort of embedded himself within the community, sort of an open door policy, sort of an all ears, all listening sort of community architect. And I think there's a really nice short quote from Erskine, which says, "I build houses," he says, "but people make the homes." And I think for me, that's an architect who's aware of the limitations of their work as an architect and planner. I just wanted to also include this quote here from Lucien Kroll, a Belgian architect, famous for his work in participation, and he reiterates this sort of mantra that we have sort of drilled into us in architecture school about commodity, firmness, and delight. And so he asks the question, but where is our humanity? Where's the humanity in the way that we build places, the way we build our cities, our housing, and all the spaces in between? And so I think sort of reflecting on it for us as a practice, our approach has been to work out what levels of engagement communities are looking for, what level of involvement do they want? Are they open? Are they closed? You know, we've had varying sort of degrees of experience from communities that, you know, perhaps don't always buy into the ideas or don't quite have the energy, and sort of who brings that energy? Is that the sort of the designer? Is that the community? Is that sort of the council? It's not just who initiates these projects. We spend a lot of time looking at sort of where the value and the benefit within the projects are. So we're always constantly scoping and briefing, you know, trying to be realistic about budgets, but always with a sort of an emphasis on the social rather than economic. And I suppose the question for today about thinking about how these spaces might manifest themselves, in that it sort of matters and it doesn't matter maybe, how a social space manifests, you know, whether it's allotments or community halls, whether it's a building, a shelter, you know, whether it's a corner of a park. I think they're both sort of equally relevant and irrelevant at the same time. And actually, we would probably say, or try to de-emphasize the end product of this sort of relationship, this participation of working with neighbourhoods and communities, and look at the process, the means to getting there, which are often as rich, if not more rich than the actual end product. So, you know, it's about galvanising communities, uniting around shared ideas. It's often a way to just meet other people within the community, to actually have some sort of forum, you know, a reason to meet, a place to meet, and a place to listen. You know, we found that in some of the work we've done with Julia, and it's finding commonalities, I think, within those communities and having that opportunity to do so. You know, it could be as simple as just two people having an interest in straw bale, and then suddenly that relationship can lead to more richer, more fruitful things in the long term. So what I was going to do here is just talk through three very quick projects, or sort of ideas of projects that we've sort of developed over the past 10 years as a partnership with my partner Claire. So an example of working at the strategic sort of city scale, the project we did for a competition which we won with the Nationwide Housing in Kilburn in West London. For those not familiar, sort of alongside a busy high street, 1960s, 1970s sort of local authority housing, which had actually been taken into cooperative ownership. And when we approach these projects, we try to set parameters and frameworks. So for this one, the interest was looking at indices for change. So we looked at urban mass, you know, physical massing, the intensity of the site, the coverage of the site. We look for sort of, you know, the leftover empty parts of the site. We look at action, community action, utilising energy and initiatives, identifying where the community is. You know, is it active? Is it collaborative? Is it cooperative? We look for opportunities for encounter, you know, neighbourliness, you know, places that would help build up social capital, you know, that generate security, form familiarity. We look at bustle for this project, so sort of urban vitality, you know, sort of can be brought about by a range of different types of sort of activity generating overlapping patterns of movement around the site, controlling bustle, looking at when you need activity and when you don't need activity across the site, and of course reviewing privacy, which comes as, I suppose, a counter to bustle. So again, it's a theoretical project, but it's effectively looking at sort of site analysis and trying to pull apart what's existing, what's already there, and whether this is, I suppose, a 1970s development or whether it's current housing that's being built. It's quite often poorly thought through. There's lots of leftover and sort of loose space, as it were. So we go about our approach in this sense to sort of try to unpack what's there, try to unpick, identify loose space, place where there's activity, vacancy, and then start to look at, I suppose, how you might increase surveillance, or you might look at vacancy, whether that's in empty spaces or empty car parks, how you might, tackle some of the noise of a busy high street, and then how you might begin to sort of modify and adapt what's already there. So yeah, that was the first project. Second project, Mainland Terrace, is slightly different, smaller scale, much smaller scale, looking at some existing housing where we were brought on board by a developer who had a sort of, I guess, a very poor boundary condition. We happen to be residents, and as a community, we sort of caught the opportunity of a developer's ear and lobbied them and put them under some pressure to modifying the conditions that the site was left in through a complex sort of boundary condition. And we spent a few evenings with them in the pub, the residents that is, developing ideas for a community growing allotment along one part of the boundary, some really simple joinery work to turn something sort of, quite unpleasant perhaps to look at and sort of ill thought through, to partner up with some local joiners, developed through several sessions with the residents, whether it's planting, whether that's shape, whether that's places to put things out and grow, whether that's places to sit, all probably delivered for under about £10,000, which sounds like a lot, but it employed 2-3 people for a month. Most of that, and sort of really interesting instance where, yes, it's a party wall, yes, it's complex. We probably, on one hand, should have gone through all the legal party wall negotiations, but as it was a sort of a community resident initiated project, the residents were able to convince the one of the builders next door to sort of use their forklift trucks. So instead of actually being combative with those neighbours, the residents managed to bring them on board as a sort of a neighbourly gesture. So they allowed us access to their JCB to sort of unload several tons of soil down there, and then we celebrated it with a sort of a community building growing day where the residents planted out the spaces, and that's it from a few weeks ago when it was very rainy, and that's the community group helped build it. There's probably about 20 people in total across a full day of sort of building and intervention work. And then the third and final project is Self-Build Guild, which again it's another sort of competition project of ours for the national, I think it was the Self-Build Association and Custom Housing Builders. And it was sort of like an anti-competition for us, so it's sort of trying to propose ideas that sort of ran against the trends, the trends of the patterns of most of the architects that submitted for this project, where they would sort of present, beautiful products of housing, thinking about housing as a product rather than as a process. So that's where we sort of transformed our approach, was to pitch a guild. So essentially a self-build guild is what we called it, and looked at that sort of collective action. So could we think about a sort of an organisation that would develop housing from start to finish, from negotiating land and managing the technical issues, the planning issues, through to bulk buying, to knowledge sharing, through to producing sort of modular SIPs, like structurally insulated panels. So sort of panels that could be lifted by 2 or 3 people and produced in an almost like factory-like sequence, So from start to finish, it's sort of an all under one roof guild of ideas, rather than sort of, you know, self-builders wanting to sort of build a house, having to start almost from scratch and employ the technical teams sort of one by one. And so, yeah, we sort of demonstrated this as a sort of a house that you could build for under £50,000 using simple modules, quite lo-fi building construction, but something that would be customizable and flexible. So it could look however you wanted, I suppose, within the remit. And again, sort of a sort of structural, internally structural free sort of approach. So it's modifiable, it's flexible within the shell. And again, that's something we'll talk about later, but sort of something we've sort of then developed later with Julia, working at the Baltic Gallery here in Newcastle for the exhibition of the North last year. Yeah, so I think, again, sort of presenting this idea of this self-build guild as something that communities could tap into, that might sort of inspire a greater level of participation in the way we make houses, the way we make spaces, and I think there's a lot of richness in that sort of collective, participative action. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, James. That's fantastic. And hopefully we'll pick up on some of these issues of use of leftover space, empty parts of the site, and also this de-emphasizing the end product. So I really like that focus on the process. I think that's really, really important. Thank you. So now I'm going to bring in Silke. I met Silke probably a couple of years ago now. Went to visit her in Brazil, and she's a professor at the School of Architecture in Belo Horizonte, and she's been part of MOM, which is a research group there since 2004, and MOM works a lot with participatory design methods and a lot with local communities there in Belo Horizonte. So hello, Silke, I'll leave it to you.
Thank you so much for having me here. This is really nice, a great opportunity. The place I'm speaking from is so radically different from Preston that I'm afraid that my comments may not help much. But anyway, I think that just the opportunity to discuss and to share some information and experiences is really great. Here you see the Belo Horizonte is halfway between Rio de Janeiro and Brasília. It's a 5 million metropolitan region. And as most Latin American cities, and in contrast to most British or European cities, Belo Horizonte is made of formally produced spaces and informally produced neighborhoods, and also many combinations of these basic types. I'm stressing this because in each case, community spaces are created, maintained, and used, transformed in quite different ways. So, this is not really working. Sorry, people, but I can't change the slide. Oh, yes, now. And yeah, this is a part, a formally produced space, as you all probably know it. It's in the city center. It has been designed, approved by the authorities, and just then built and used. The state and private developers are in control of this kind of space, sometimes relying on more or less effective citizen participation. But anyway, this is the kind of space production that we as architects and planners are usually trained for. Informally produced spaces, like this one here, are actually, they may look the same, but they have very different logics. So all they they all go in some way against the law, but are tolerated anyway because the city would collapse without them. Many working class people live in this kind of spaces. As I said, informality is not always the same. It differs depending on the historical and social processes which generate them. They can be, for instance, as you see here, favelas, or so-called favelas, here in the foreground. These are spaces occupied by people over a long time without any master plan or centralized decision. Here we have this same favela that you saw before, and so we're part of it. And here you can see how over decades it grows and grows. And only in the end, in 2010, you see that some kind of formal roads and streets were built inside this favela. In the beginning, this kind of space is plenty of green areas and common land, which people use for any kind of activities, but which tend to disappear as more and more people come and build their houses there. In the end, when the municipality intervenes, usually they open up some of these spaces again, but also evicting many people, which is quite a bad thing. Then we have, here, this is just to show how they kind of preserve spontaneously certain community spaces which are really used and which make sense for them, such as these soccer field. Then we have another kind of development undertaken by smaller capitalists or even by popular cooperatives, as the case here. At first sight, it may look like favelas, like a favela, but the process is completely different. People buy the land and they follow a plan, including, here you can see the plan, it was made before. And it includes green areas and community spaces and so on. But they do not fulfill all legal requirements and do not have real urban infrastructure. Here you see the plan and the first streets and how it looked later and even today. This wooden power pole is a hint for the lack of infrastructure here in the foreground. Nevertheless, at least in this case here, the open spaces have been preserved over time, not being occupied by newcomers. So they could be used and changed in a good way. Still another process are the so-called organized occupations. They are carried out by social movements as a form of resistance, protest, and struggle for rights. They also have urban plans, but they do not buy the land. In the lower left corner of this picture, you see their camping tents, and then literally overnight, they put their plan into practice. They do this by hand without machines or equipments, and it looks a bit uneven because of that. And once it is occupied, then they begin the legal struggle to be formally recognized. This is why they basically follow the rules, leaving green and community spaces. This very area 9 years later looks like that. All that community space and green space is taken by private houses. And the only community space is a little triangle right in the middle for a church. Negotiations with the state went wrong. They have not been recognized, so they just kind of occupied. This year, we were kind of involved in this particular urban occupation. This is a kind of community game which people played in the beginning to define their plan. It's a game just to help them to show what the collective outcome of their individual decisions could be. Okay, so what I want to stress here is that for us in Belo Horizonte or in Brazil, formally production usually means decision and agency centralized by the state or by some kind of capital, despite official citizen participation, while on the other hand, informal production is rather decentralized. But also, formal spaces can become informal and vice versa. And clashes between these two basic modes of space production are constant. I show you some example. In the upper left corner of this picture, you can see a kind of library under a tree. It's a legal neighborhood, but the library had been created by a street dweller who also had built a little house for him in that tree. People would take a book and leave another one for free. And it was just kind of fun and kind of a legend of this place, of this neighborhood. Then someone set the tree, the books, and the tree house on fire. But the municipality decided to keep the open library and put some book boxes there, just kind of replacing the tree and all this structure. The street dweller came back and added new elements to make it a nicer, more attractive place. This is the second picture there in the in the right upper corner. But the municipality took all these informal elements away again, cleaning everything. As you see in the next picture and then in the last picture, so people just stopped coming. But nowadays, this street dweller is kind of rebuilding all this again, what he did there before. This here, for instance, are informal community spaces. You can see it here in the smaller picture. And then the intervention made by the municipality, which may even look nicer, but in fact it's not. So this is what this place looked before and what it became later. So here in the smaller pictures, these are informal community spaces, mostly vegetable gardens and accesses. And here, for instance, no, I'm not sorry. Yeah, and then the bigger picture is this community space formally planned and so on. It's also used, but not actually so much. Then here, yeah, now I just want to show you kind of quickly some of experience that we have made to trying to engage people in different areas. This here is a formal area with this kind of pylons as you have in Preston, and it's not used. And then we tried to make this is a kind of website trying to make the neighbors, people of this community, the surroundings, participate in deciding what this area could be. And here they could choose some kinds of activities and leisure activities and sports and so on. And they could also comment and talk to each other. And we hoped to be able to decide which activities would be more appropriated by this community. But actually the experience went quite wrong. People didn't engage and they were not very interested in it. It looks like that. This is quite recent, a picture. So it's still there without anyone doing anything about it. This here is another experiment. It's similar. Again, we have a website. People could put their opinions and places and proposals and whatever in this community and certain spaces. This worked quite well. People, they had a lot of fun with it. And yeah, this is the place. It doesn't look so nice, but actually it's full of life. It's very interesting. Here you can see this is a small event that people did there just to exchange recipes and vegetables and things like that. This year these are another events like cinema, open air cinema, and also communication between different parts of these informal communities, so that people could see each other at different places. This is very fun. Children love it. So yeah, and here you see again a partly formal, partly informal kind of appropriation of a green area. I'm sorry, but I had an overall picture here at my home. But anyway, it's a very intensely used space by many different groups of this community, beginning from older people, but also younger, and people doing vegetable gardens and sports and things like that. And here, this is my last example. It's just a small community in a more rural area. And these people, they don't know how to read and write. So we tried to, let me be a bit quicker here. Yes, they have this church there and so on. And they had money to build a community center. And we tried to engage them in a process of co-design, which was very difficult because they are rather unused to this kind of conversation, and very poor people and not very urban people, so to speak. In the beginning, we tried to write things down and so on, but this didn't work. So we began to work with pictures, which was better. And also, in the end, we kind of made this little packages of participatory material and went to each household explaining what we were doing and giving people these materials. Basically, they are kind of pieces of a building design, so to speak. And it was really funny because they didn't understand what actually this meant, but they invented the spaces which they thought would be nice or would be interesting, would be useful. And just bringing these things they did and explaining us what they meant by them was enough to give a whole set of new ideas to the process. So in the end, the conclusion was, it's not so important that people actually understand everything or that we find this common and very precise language. The important part is that people actually have the opportunity to engage themselves and to tell their stories. Yeah, this was the end result. And then they decided upon this community space, and it was really fun. And yeah, what I want to stress in this whole story is that people need autonomy to create their community spaces and to maintain these spaces, to use them, to change them over time. In our case, I think this idea of an autonomous production of space is much more strong. It's much stronger in informal communities. But the problem is that the municipality and the state and so on, they use the arguments of autonomy as an excuse to not giving money to people, money for these community spaces. And on the other hand, left side governments, they say, oh, okay, let's do everything nice and so on, but autonomy is rather not the point. It's more like participation. Yeah, and that's it. So what I would suggest is, let's give people let's support people's autonomy, not designing ready products, but designing interfaces so that they can decide what they want to do and still give them money so that they are able to do it. Yeah, that's basically it. So thank you very much, Julia, and everybody.
Thank you, Silke. That was fantastic to hear. Such different contexts, but often similar sorts of issues in terms of participation, in terms of collaboration between authorities. And I think there's definitely, obviously contexts are very, very different, but I think there's some really interesting points of learning as well between them. So I'm going to open up the sort of comments now, and if people have any comments or questions, just to write them in the comments bar on YouTube, and then they'll show up, and then I can ask one of the participants. So that'd be great. We can start a discussion. I've got something to sort of start us off, really. Both of you spoke about this space between the planned and the unplanned, between the formal and the informal. But obviously this space is a very grey space. You know, nothing is ever completely formal and nothing is ever completely informal either. And often, as you say, the informal becomes the formal. So, you know, often in the way that people appropriate space, the authorities might then come in and go, well, actually, people are using this in a certain way, like the skate park. Why don't we actually make this a formal skate park, for example? But in the end, it does require sort of negotiation between authorities and between developers. But I guess one key question is, how do you continue to make space for this sort of unplanned, the ability for communities to continue to appropriate their community, I guess? How do you do that? Is there a possibility to do that? And how, as sort of architects or planners, might you enable people to do that, to take ownership of some space in that way, and to appropriate it in that way, I guess? Should we start with James?
There's a lot of questions there, Julia.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. How might we leave space for future communities? I suppose it's always there, even in the most planned sort of context, you know, sort of new housing estates, particularly what we're looking at in the context here of Preston. There's always sort of loose space, you know, ill-defined spaces, which I suppose largely comes from sort of probably quite poorly planned neighbourhoods. I think the difficulties in finding those communities and organising those communities, I think, is probably, as you found in your work, how do you bring them together? How do you organise them? How do you sort of empower or sort of inspire those communities to sort of interact with their worlds? Often I think a lot of people, I think there's a cultural problem, particularly in the UK, with sort of the way we think about our environment. It's very shut down, it's very controlled, it's very sort of managed. So I think it's difficult. I don't know if there's it's incredibly difficult, I think.
I think you're right. I think in terms of the sort of participatory process and taking sort of ownership of space, you know, you were talking about the need for autonomy over space, Silke. I think that is just something that is so culturally outside of us in the UK that we often don't even have the ability to imagine how we would take ownership of space, if you know what I mean. So perhaps the Brazilian sort of culture of that can offer us some pointers. I don't know what you think, Silke.
Yeah, actually, it's funny because middle class people or high class people, so to speak, here they think that it should be everything just like in Europe or in the UK. So a bit like a shopping center, they imagine it. You have some managers who kind of manage everything and define everything, and everything looks nice and tidy all the time. And you just walk through and enjoy without engaging in any way. And actually, they like it when the government or the state, the municipality intervene in favelas and make them look nicer or tidier or cleaner or whatever. But for the people living there, this is rather the bad thing to do. And what we are all the time trying is, look, people's autonomy or relative autonomy is not their problem. This is a good thing. Their problem is the lack of money, obviously. So let's, instead of just suppressing this, which is very powerful and the only way to manage a big city, because it's impossible to be there formally all the time. Let's increase their means of doing it. And yes, I think, yeah, you are right. Everything you said is, I absolutely agree. It's strange for many people, and also even in the universities, it's not the normal thing to do. People think, oh, this what you are doing is not architecture, this is not urban planning or whatever.
I think money is a key thing. I think sometimes people don't like talking about it because they think it's a dirty word, but you're right, people need access to finance and to financial resources. You know, and we can't sort of deny that, you know, particularly living in, you know, 10 years of austerity, you really start to see that the sort of gaps start to show within communities. And I'm sure it's similar in Brazil as well. We've got a couple of questions. So one from Rivington Rigby, asking whether Silke could explain more about how the Jogo Occupy game helps to plan settlements. But also, I guess, a wider question about how we can learn from communities on the other side of the world as well.
Mm-hmm. So very briefly, this is not to make the design or the plan itself, but to show people what it means. For instance, if they, in this case, it was particularly interesting because they realized how much green or community space they would have if each of them had an individual plot, building just one store or something like this. And if they kind of built a multi-story units or something like this. So it was more for them to kind of open up their spatial imagination to think of other possible ways to do it, and not just this one way, a small plot and a small little house on it. And also they learned about how to manage infrastructure like water and so on, because you have these little pieces there which kind of represent water supply and sewage and so on, and they have to install this in an abstract on an abstract piece of land, but it makes them, the discussion goes in a different way than before. This is the point. This was the point. So it's not the planning itself coming out of it. You are muted, Julia.
Thanks, Silke. Thanks very much for that. There's also a question from Benedict Rutherford. Are there examples in the UK where people have taken ownership of space? James, I'm going to put that one to you.
Yes, there's lots of examples. They can range from sort of quite informal, tactical examples, I suppose, the term sort of tactical urbanism and sort of occupying sort of car parking spaces. It could be as simple as that, sort of leftover triangles of land, those sort of those peripheral spaces of housing estates. There's plenty of sort of a history of people doing sort of small intervention, through to, I suppose, examples in the UK taken. You start to have to looking at sorts of models of housing, like cooperative models, where communities have come together, they've identified a need for land and for housing supply, and then they've sort of gone through that sort of process of buying land or finding different financial models to buy the land, and then to work as a group to develop housing on housing options through all sorts of sort of quite inventive sort of financial models, different sort of shared equity and different ownership levels. I think they're probably the best examples I can think of off the top of my head.
Yeah, there's also some really good examples in Scotland. I would definitely look at the Scottish land reform movement, because I think that's particularly interesting in terms of communities being able to take ownership of quite large areas of land, which have basically, in many cases, just been left by landowners, or what they call lairds. And there's some fantastic examples of whole islands which have been taken into community ownership, such as the Isle of Egg, which is probably the most famous example. Yeah. That was about 20 years ago. So I definitely look to Scotland. I think they're sort of head and shoulders above anything that is happening in England with regards to ownership of land anyway.
They definitely have a more liberal approach. Sorry, I just said the Scottish have a definitely more liberal approach to land, a sort of more sort of, free access almost as a sort of given right, whereas we have sort of more restrictive, sort of almost like trespass laws that sort of prevent sort of any sort of even access, let alone sort of change or intervention in land.
Definitely look to Scotland. So I've got a question from Alessio, and he's asking, it's a question for Silke, do communities have interest in changing their urban space?
Yeah, sorry, can you just repeat this one?
Alessio is asking, do communities have an interest in changing their urban space? Do they think it would be possible?
Yes, I think so. They are very different from each other. For instance, some of them are, as we call it, territorialized by the drug traffic people. And in this case, it's very different. It's very difficult to establish community spaces because they kind of control this. Other communities are not, and then things kind of flow in a more easy way. For instance, the one which was used to be a popular cooperative, which I showed you, they had this plan. It's really a nice place. It could be a wonderful place, and these people are really interested in changing it, but they don't have the necessary lobby to be recognized as a formal place or having any support, financial support and infrastructure support from the municipality, for instance. So I think that it differs. The answer is some have an interest, but yes, and some kind of don't. But the problem is, what would be changing their urban space? I would say that, and there are also some research about this, but for instance, people living in favelas, more than half of them would not like to live in formal areas because it's just you can do anything, you can build, you can change your house, you can anything. So they really prefer to live there. It's not like, oh, this terrible place. It's really not like that. I don't know
Because
if
I
this
guess-
answers the question. Sorry.
Because I guess there's that sense of freedom. Obviously, within the UK, as I mentioned before, it's a very different context, and particularly within this development in Northwest Preston, where it's all about engaging with local authorities and the developers, and there's many developers working on that site. So Joanne is a resident, and she lives in one of the new housing developments in the Cotton area, which is really close. And she says they seem to have Facebook groups to keep in touch. But what about work with the site developers to engage new occupants? Is that a potential? What are the sort of pitfalls of that, I guess? James? I'm going to go to you.
It would be, I suppose in an ideal world, the developers would have worked from the outset. So you're sort of having to work slightly in a backwards sort of method. But I think to try to strike up for the community a relationship with the house builders, I don't know how easy that is. Like we did on that project for the planters, it was quite a small development of maybe sort of 80 houses. And so the residents knew the developer. Often I think there's that sort of relationship, depending on who's building the houses, to sort of keep the end occupier at arm's length. So I think the best they could do is probably to sort of try to build relationships with those developers, because if they have probably a long-term interest in not just maintaining the spaces, but sort of making that an attractive community for the future. Certainly a strong economic interest in that. I don't know if they have a social interest, but I think trying to sort of strike up those relationships and looking for money from them is one way of doing it. Sort of trying to identify a need, so sort of finding an area, sort of leftover space, finding a need through that Facebook group, I think would be a good start, and then sort of trying to approach that developer. Ultimately, they're the people with the money. Unfortunately, the local authorities, who would probably more like to be on your side, don't.
Absolutely. That's my experience. I'm going to take one quick last question because we've only got a couple of minutes left. And it's from Isabel. So she says, do you think that this type of tactical urbanism, so by tactical urbanism, she's sort of talking about low cost, temporary changes to the built environment, quick changes, I guess. So can these types of tactical urbanism be used and effective in informal areas, or is this a kind of trial of formalizing informality? Wow. So is there any real sort of examples of that? And I'm going to go to Silke for that last question.
This is a difficult one for a last minute question. I would say both. It can be used and effective in informal areas, and it's sometimes a trial of formalizing informality. Again, I think that the pattern is, as long as there is no money, you can have autonomy and do whatever you want. But as soon as money appears, finances appear, then we, the state or the developers or whoever, we will take control. And this is, I think this is the point where we should change things, really. That's it, basically. So kind of formalizing informality or formalizing people's autonomy, collective autonomy, obviously not individual one, to really produce space or produce parts of the city by themselves and manage them and change them and sustain them and so on. Having technical support from urban planners and architects and so on, and also have the financial resources to do this.
Thanks, Silke. I think that's a key sort of takeaway, is it's about resourcing communities. And I think that's the key thing, it's about enabling communities, really. and enabling professionals to work in that way with communities as well is important. I think we have to leave it there, but thank you very much, both of you, for your contributions, and thanks to In Certain Places as well for hosting this and putting it on and organising these creative infrastructure labs as well. Thank you very much, and thanks very much for watching.
Thank you, Julia.
Thank you, Julia.